Elon Musk didn't know why he'd agreed to attend the charity gala in Austin that evening. His calendar was a battlefield, as always, crammed with rocket launches, AI panels, back-to-back briefings on everything from solar grids in sub-Saharan Africa to tunnel delays beneath Las Vegas. He'd almost canceled 3 times. But there was something oddly comforting about the low-stakes anonymity of a benefit dinner where he was just another donor in a tuxedo. No speeches, no interviews, just a night to disappear into the crowd and maybe write mental notes for a Martian colony design while pretending to enjoy the creme brulee. The venue was the kind of place where chandeliers sparkled like frozen fireworks, and the wine had backstories longer than the average novel. Laughter floated through the air, clinking glasses punctuated by half-baked toasts, and Elon had just ducked away from a conversation about NFTs when he spotted her. Or rather, she spotted him. Elon. The voice hit him like an echo from another lifetime, warm, familiar, completely unexpected. He turned slowly, and for a split second, the noise of the gala dissolved into silence. There she was, Laura Kilmer. She hadn't changed all that much. Her hair was a little shorter now, curling just above her shoulders, and there were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but her smile? That was exactly the same. It had that same lopsided curve that used to make everything feel okay when the world felt impossibly cruel. For a second, the teenage version of himself, the awkward kid with bruised ribs and a head full of Starship sketches, stood in awe. "Elon," she said again, this time stepping closer, her eyes searching his. "It's really you." He blinked. "Laura, wow. I didn't know you were in Austin. I moved here a few years ago. Family, work life." Her eyes darted briefly to the side, as if signaling something or someone. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He barely had time to process her words before a man stepped out from behind her. Elon's brain registered a few details at once. Tall, early 40s, slightly hunched posture, a gray coat that didn't quite fit, and a face he knew all too well. A face that should have stayed buried in the archives of memory. Rick Danvers. The name alone triggered a cold pulse behind his eyes. Elon stood frozen, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat. For a second, it was like he was back at Bryanston High School in South Africa, just another wiry teenager walking down a hallway lined with wolves in uniform. Rick hadn't just been any bully, he was one of the main ones. A ringleader, a predator in sneakers. He was the one who pushed Elon down a flight of stairs so hard he blacked out. The incident left Elon hospitalized with a broken nose and a deep crack in his trust for other people. It was the kind of betrayal that burns itself into your bones. Now that face, older lined but unmistakable, was staring back at him. Rick's eyes were lowered, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him, and for once, there was no swagger, no smug grin, no lazy confidence that once fed on the suffering of others. He looked small, like a man trying to disappear into his own shadow. "Elon," Laura said gently, noticing the sudden tension in his expression. "This is my husband, Rick." The words dropped like stones. Husband. He wanted to laugh. How was this real? The girl who passed him notes in physics class, who helped him find the library after school when no one else would talk to him, had ended up with the guy who used to shove him into lockers? Musk's chest tightened, and he couldn't tell if it was anger or disbelief, or both. Rick looked up. His lips parted like he was about to speak, but no words came. Elon could see it in his eyes: recognition, regret, and something else. Shame. Thick, unspoken, undeniable shame. We didn't come here to surprise you," Laura continued, sensing the storm swirling beneath Elon's expression. "I didn't know you'd be here either. It's just, well, we're here because we need help." Help. Of course. Elon took a half step back, scanning both of their faces as if trying to decode whether this was some elaborate prank, some karmic joke being played at his expense. But it wasn't. There was nothing theatrical in their posture. No deception. Just a familiar woman he once trusted, standing next to a man he once feared, both of them older now, carrying invisible burdens. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, but none of them prepared him for this moment. His mouth went dry. All he could hear was the distant clatter of cutlery and the dull buzz of laughter across the ballroom. It all felt unreal, like he'd fallen into a parallel dimension where the past hadn't stayed buried. Rick finally spoke, voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Elon, I." But Elon held up a hand sharply. "No." That was all he said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of years of hospital visits, bloody noses, humiliation, and the slow, agonizing climb from the bottom of the social food chain. He wasn't ready for this. Not now. Maybe not ever. Without another word, he turned and walked away, pushing past the caterers and murmuring guests. Behind him, he heard Laura call his name once more, softly, pleadingly. But he didn't turn back. He couldn't. Not yet. Not tonight. The past hit him like a punch to the gut. No metaphor, no exaggeration. Elon Musk felt it physically, like his organs had suddenly remembered the trauma before his brain could process it. 1 second, he was standing on polished marble beneath a glittering chandelier. The next, he was back at Bryanston High School in South Africa, sprawled at the base of a concrete staircase, blood running down from his nose, eyes unfocused, ears ringing. Rick Danvers had laughed then. Not a nervous laugh or a childish giggle, but a cruel, triumphant howl that echoed in Elon's skull for weeks. That staircase was notorious, narrow, steep, and cold as hell in mornings. Rick had pushed him from the second landing for no reason other than amusement. No provocation, just a bored predator looking for a weaker target. Elon had blacked out halfway down. We woke up in the nurse's office. His mother was there, eyes red, speaking in clipped tones to the principal. The school called it an accident. Rick got 2 days of detention. Elon got a mild concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a belief that people as a rule were not to be trusted. He had buried that day. He'd buried so many of those days, each one stacked neatly in a psychological vault sealed under ambition and invention. He had rockets to build, planets to colonize, AI to tame. There was no room for the echoes of adolescent cruelty. But now here it was again, standing in front of him in human form, aged but recognizable, wrapped in guilt and a borrowed blazer. Rick's eyes met his for a second, just a flicker, and Elon could see the weight there. Not just age, not just fatigue. Guilt. Thick, clinging, inescapable guilt. The kind that follows you through decades and dark hallways. Rick wasn't smiling. Not really. It was more of a reflex, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar and too old to cry. And Laura, sweet, sharp-witted Laura, stood between them like an uneasy bridge. She wasn't wearing guilt. She was wearing something far more painful. Hope. Hope that maybe this moment could be salvaged. That the Elon she once knew still existed beneath the steel-gray persona of the billionaire inventor. That he might remember not just the pain, but the friendship, too. "Elon," she said again, gently this time, "we need your help." There it was. The line, the ask, the invitation into a twisted moral labyrinth. Elon didn't say anything. Not at first. His breath had gone shallow. His surroundings faded into a blur, like someone had turned down the saturation on the world. The music, the lights, the hum of shallow conversations, none of it registered. He felt like he was watching his own body from above, like he wasn't really there. Just an echo. Help? Help him? Help the same kid who once taped a note to his locker that said, "Go back to Mars, freak." The same kid who used to trip him in the cafeteria, laugh when his books spilled everywhere, then mimic his accent for weeks. Elon's hands curled into fists at his sides before he consciously realized it. His jaw clenched. He didn't care if Rick had aged into some repentant husk of a man. He didn't care what sob story they brought. There were some things you didn't come back from. Some debts too old, too stained to ever be settled. His eyes moved from Rick to Laura, and that made it worse. Laura wasn't a part of the pain. She had been the bright spot in a dim, cruel chapter of his life. She was the one who taught him how to draw planetary orbits using a compass and a string. She used to sit beside him during lunch, talking about sci-fi novels and laughing at the absurdity of teenage drama. She had saved him in ways she never knew. And now she was married to the man who broke him. "Elon," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for him to notice. "Please, I know this is hard, but he's not the same." No, Elon didn't want to hear it. Not tonight. Not here, not now. He took a step back. The marble beneath his shoes suddenly felt like ice. The tension in his chest wrapped tighter, like a wire pulled too far. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. His throat was a dry canyon of rage and disbelief. He shook his head, once firmly, then turned away. No words. No confrontación. No scene. Just distance. He walked toward the exit, past glittering gowns and handshakes and the scent of overpriced cologne. He heard Laura call his name behind him, once, twice. Rick didn't speak again. Good. He didn't deserve the luxury of words. Elon didn't stop until he was outside, past the valet line, standing beneath the raw, indifferent sky of a Texas night. The stars were out, bright, piercing, silent. He stared at them as if they could offer answers. They didn't. His car pulled up, a sleek black Tesla humming like a cat waiting for attention. As he slid into the back seat, his driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, registering something off in his expression. "Everything all right, Mr. Musk?" Elon didn't answer, just waved a hand vaguely and stared out the window as they pulled away. Inside the gala, life went on. Champagne flowed. Toasts were made. But Elon Musk's mind was elsewhere, rewinding to a time when his knees were scraped and his dignity was a daily casualty. And now, decades later, the man who once laughed as he bled was asking for help. Through the voice of someone Elon had once loved like family. The irony was cruel, almost cinematic. But real life didn't come with script. And Elon wasn't sure how this scene was supposed to end. Not yet. The Tesla Model S glided silently through the dimly lit streets of downtown Austin, its tinted windows reflecting the amber city lights as they slipped past in streaks of gold. Inside the car, the atmosphere was heavy. The cabin, sleek and quiet by design, felt almost too quiet now, like a sensory deprivation chamber built to trap thoughts instead of protect them. Elon sat in the rear passenger seat, shoulders rigid, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His jaw worked in slow, tense movements, as though he were chewing over a bitter taste that wouldn't go away. Up front, his assistant glanced at him through the rear-view mirror. She was used to his silences. Elon was often more comfortable in his own mind than in conversation, but something about this silence felt different. He hadn't cracked a joke in hours. Not even a sarcastic observation about the gala's painfully uninspired playlist, or the guy who called him Eli while holding a shrimp cocktail. "You okay?" she asked finally softly. He responded with a noise that sat somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. Not quite yes. Definitely not no. Then he looked back out the window, as if the blurred skyline might offer an answer he couldn't find inside himself. But inside was a very different story. The past was clawing its way up from the basement of his memory, dragging with it images he had locked away decades ago. The sound of old metal lockers clanging shut. The wet smack of sneakers in the hallway after gym class. The cruel rhythm of Rick Danvers' laugh, harsh, nasal, always accompanied by the smell of cheap cologne and cafeteria fries. And the locker. God, the locker. That goddamn locker. The one next to the science lab. Musk could still smell it if he let his mind go too far. Stale gym clothes, pencil shavings, the faint metallic tang of rust. He'd been shoved inside it more than once, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an entire lunch period. Rick thought it was hilarious. So did his friends. They'd slide notes through the vents with crude sketches and slogans. Martian freak, rocket boy, go back to space. Musk never told the teachers. Never told his parents either. What would have been the point? "You're weird," they'd say. "You ask for it. Toughen up." And so he had. He built mental walls instead of friendships, circuits instead of memories. And eventually he built rockets. Rockets that could leave all of them and their tiny little cruelties far behind. But now, decades later, the past had walked into a ballroom in a cheap blazer and asked for his help. Help. The word repeated itself in his head like a glitch in the system, over and over until it felt like static beneath his skin. He clenched his fists tighter, feeling his nails press into his palms. He wasn't even sure who he was angry at. Rick, obviously, but also himself, for feeling anything at all, for letting it get to him, for walking out of that ballroom like some wounded teenager when he was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful men on Earth. He could have said something witty, dismissive. He could have played it cool, left them standing there without a clue what he was thinking. Instead, he walked away like a man who'd seen a ghost. Wasn't he past this? Hadn't he won? He was Elon Musk, the guy who launched a Tesla into space just because he could, the guy who made flamethrowers for fun and broke the internet more often than most people updated their apps. He had 6 kids, 3 companies, and 17 different legal teams. Why the hell was one high school memory unraveling him? The car turned sharply, and for a brief moment, the movement shook him out of the spiral. He exhaled hard and leaned his head back against the seat. The leather was cool, too smooth, too sterile. It didn't help. He closed his eyes and tried to think of something else. Anything else. Starship fuel optimization. LiDAR arrays. The Boring Company tunnel grid under Ontario. Nothing stuck. His mind kept circling back to that staircase. The push. The impact. The laughter. And now Rick's face. Older. Weathered. Hollowed out by time and something else. Regret. Could people really change? The thought made him scoff aloud, startling his assistant. "You said something," she asked. "No, nothing," he muttered. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. He thought about Laura, about how her eyes had looked when she said, "He's not the same." The way her voice cracked, not out of guilt, but desperation. There was love there. Real, painful, lived-in love. The kind forged through trials, not fairy tales. And that made it worse somehow, because it meant she believed it. That Rick had changed. That there was something left to save. Didn't mean Elon had to believe it, though. Didn't mean he had to forget. But even as the anger simmered, there was something underneath it. Something quieter and far more dangerous. Doubt. A small, nagging part of him that remembered how lonely those days had been. How badly he had wanted someone to step in, to stand up for him, to simply say, "Hey, leave the kid alone." But no one did. Not even Laura. She was kind, yes. But she never confronted Rick. No one ever did. And now here they were, asking him to be the bigger person. To rise above. To be the hero. He wasn't sure he had it in him. The car pulled into the long driveway of his Austin residence, a low-lit, modernist sprawl tucked behind tall trees and silence. As the engine powered down, Elon didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the dashboard, breathing slow and hard. "Do you need anything else, Mr. Musk?" his assistant asked gently. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Just give me a minute." She nodded and stepped out. Elon remained in the car a while longer, hands finally unclenching, but not from peace. From exhaustion. The past wasn't behind him. It had been waiting, and now it wanted an answer. 3 days passed, but Elon hadn't shaken it off. Not Rick's face, not Laura's voice, not the strange collision of past and present that had unsettled something deep inside him. He had buried high school under empires and moonshots, but like tectonic plates shifting beneath a calm surface, it was rising again. The anger, the humiliation, the confusion, and now a knock on his carefully reinforced reality. He was reviewing prototype schematics in his Palo Alto office when his assistant knocked, hesitated, and peeked in. "There's a woman downstairs. Says she knows you. Refuses to leave." Elon looked up. "Name?" "Laura Kilmer." He paused. Just that name stirred something he couldn't quite name. He hadn't expected to see her again, at least not this soon. He certainly hadn't expected her to show up at the Tesla headquarters like someone trying to breach orbit without clearance. "I'll meet her in the lobby," he said. The walk down was fast, mechanical. He tapped through a backlog of messages on his phone to avoid thinking. But the moment the elevator doors opened and he saw her standing there beneath the massive Tesla logo, everything stopped again. Laura wasn't the same girl who used to doodle constellations on his school books. She was older now, but she stood with the same poise. Her red hair was pulled back loosely, strands falling against a face lined more with worry than age. Her coat was buttoned neatly, but her eyes betrayed urgency, desperation even. "Elon," she said softly, like it was still safe to use his first name. "I'm sorry for just showing up." "You could have called," he replied, crossing his arms not cruelly, but not warmly either. She stepped forward. "I didn't think you'd answer." He said nothing. Laura's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "Rick is dying." He blinked. "Dying?" She nodded. "It's a rare mitochondrial disorder. MG. Degenerative. He's losing function fast. We've seen specialists all over the country, and the only promising treatment is in Germany. A clinical trial in Munich. Gene therapy, but access is limited. You have connections there, Elon. You could help us get in." Elon didn't speak for several seconds. The silence was electric. "You're asking me," he said slowly, "to pull strings for Rick Danvers. The same Rick Danvers who shoved me down a flight of stairs, who made 3 years of my life feel like a prison sentence." Laura didn't flinch. She'd known this would come. "Yes," she said, "that same Rick. I'm not defending what he did. I never have. But he's not that person anymore." "You say that like people just evolve," Elon replied bitterly. "Like hate and humiliation evaporate with age. I'm saying pain changes people. I'm saying tragedy forces growth. After our son died, Rick shattered. He spent the last 10 years trying to become a man that boy would have been proud of." That took the air out of Elon's lungs for a second. He looked away, jaw tight. "I didn't know you lost a child." Laura's voice softened. "We didn't tell many people. He was 6. Brain tumor. It rewired everything inside us. Rick's grief turned into something else, remorse, reflection. He's been volunteering at community centers, working with at-risk kids, trying to stop the cycle he was part of. And now," Elon said, staring out the tall windows, "he needs a favor from the kid he nearly destroyed." Laura stepped closer, careful not to intrude. "Not just a favor, a chance. You're the only one who can open this particular door. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't life or death." Elon turned back toward her. His eyes searched her face, not for lies, but for signs of a girl he used to trust. And he saw it. Somewhere beneath the years and sorrow, she was still there. But her plea was more than friendship. It was layered with guilt, hope, and a quiet insistence that people, even the worst ones, could change. "I haven't forgiven him," Elon said. "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I'm asking you to be who you've always been. The guy who believes the future can be better, who sees solutions where other people see dead ends." He didn't answer. Not right away. He just looked at her, really looked, like he was trying to calculate something impossible. She stood her ground. Finally, he exhaled. "Leave your information with the front desk." Laura blinked. "Does that mean?" "It means I'll think about it." She nodded. "That's all I can ask." And with that, she turned and walked slowly toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Elon remained standing in a lobby long after the doors closed behind her. It was easier to say no, easier to let Rick fade into the dark where he belonged. But something in Laura's voice had cracked open a part of him that had been sealed too tightly for too long. And now that part was wide awake. "He's changed, Elon. You don't know what he's been through." Laura's voice had trembled, not from manipulation, but from something rawer, heavier. "We lost a child. After that, he was never the same." Those words had followed Elon home like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Not that night, not the next. Even with blackout blinds and silence optimized by soundproof glass, sleep wouldn't come. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling more like a satellite in drift than the man usually at the helm of empires. The room was dark except for the faint light of the moon slashing through a gap in the curtains, illuminating the polished concrete floor. Normally, this was when he felt calm, alone, unplugged, able to think freely. But now his thoughts were anything but free. They were shackled to the image of Laura's eyes as she spoke, heavy with grief that didn't ask for pity, only understanding. A child, a son. He didn't know they had children. He'd never thought about Rick having a family. In his mind, Rick Danvers was forever 17, loud, cruel, hollow in the way bullies often are. A creature of adolescent chaos. Not a man who could hold a baby in his arms. Not someone who could know love that deep, or loss that unimaginable. Elon rolled onto his side and stared at the faint outline of the bookshelf across the room. One of the volumes, spine faded from age, was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Laura had given him that copy on his 15th birthday. She wrote inside the front cover, "Don't panic. You'll need this more than most." She had always been that way, funny without being mean, smart without needing to prove it. In high school, when everyone else saw him as the awkward kid with weird ideas and an accent no one could place, she saw potential. Maybe even something noble. He remembered the notes she used to pass him in class, always folded into absurd shapes, paper rockets, stars, one time even a functioning mini catapult. She'd doodle aliens piloting electric cars or write mock conversations between planets. They were like secret transmissions from a world far kinder than the one he lived in daily. And then there were the other notes, the ones Rick got his hands on. Musk clenched his jaw. He could still see it, Rick grabbing one of Laura's folded notes, spitting on it before tossing it back in his face. "What is this Martian love poetry?" he'd said. Everyone laughed, except Laura. She looked horrified. She hadn't meant for it to be read aloud. That moment had stuck with him, not because of the embarrassment. It was far from the worst he'd endured, but because it was the first time Laura looked powerless. Like she realized how dangerous her kindness could be to someone like him. And now she was asking him to return the favor, to offer compassion to the very man who'd made high school feel like a war zone. He sat up in bed, rubbing his hands over his face. It was past 2 in the morning. His calendar was merciless tomorrow. Conference calls, site visits, another pending lawsuit. He should be resting, recharging. But how do you sleep when the dead are knocking? It wasn't just the fact that Rick was sick. It was the way Laura said it. The way she described the aftermath of their son's death. Elon didn't have to imagine how grief could change someone. He'd lived enough of it himself. He'd buried friends, lovers, his own firstborn son. That thought stopped him cold. Nevada Alexander Musk. He rarely spoke his name, rarely even thought it. The pain didn't grow dull with time. It simply grew quieter, like a frequency most people couldn't hear anymore. But it was there, always. He stood up and walked barefoot across the floor, pausing at the window. The city lights below flickered like distant stars. From up here, everything looked ordered, manageable. But pain had no symmetry. It didn't follow the rules of logic or orbit. He leaned on the windowsill, staring at nothing in particular. Could Rick really have changed? Or was it just Laura seeing what she needed to see, trying to preserve some version of her husband that hadn't died along with their son? Musk didn't know, and that uncertainty infuriated him. He hated not knowing. Uncertainty was for gamblers and philosophers, not engineers. Engineers dealt in truth, systems, measurables. And yet here he was calculating the unquantifiable. How much pain equaled redemption? How many years of remorse canceled out 3 years of cruelty? He returned to bed but didn't lie down. Instead, he sat on the edge, elbows on knees, hands clasped tightly. His mind replayed their conversation over and over. The way she'd said he's not the same. The way she looked at him. Not pleading, not manipulating, just asking for a flicker of empathy. And the part that disturbed him the most wasn't that Rick was sick. It was that a part of him, however small, wanted to believe her. He didn't want to forgive, didn't want to offer grace. But there was something about the way Laura carried her pain, about the honesty in her voice, that pierced the armor he'd spent decades building. He didn't trust Rick, but he trusted her. He stood again and walked to his desk, tapping his tablet awake. The screen glowed. He opened his contacts, hesitated, then typed, Dr. Ank Weber, Munich Institute for Mitochondrial Research. He didn't hit send, but he didn't delete it either. The memories were tangled now, like wires behind an old computer, knotted and dusty, but still very much alive with current. Elon Musk stood barefoot in his living room, arms folded as he stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows into the nothingness beyond. Somewhere out there, satellites he had launched circled the planet. Billions of dollars in machinery. Thousands of people working under his name. 100 headlines a week about what he might do next. But inside, in the quietest chambers of his mind, he was just a kid again. Thin, quiet, always calculating, not the physics of rockets, but the geometry of avoidance. Which corners of the hallway had the sharpest turns? Which doors had mirrors, so he could see if someone was coming up behind him? He remembered walking through those corridors at Bryanston High like he was navigating a minefield, each day a small war with laughter as the ammunition. He didn't just remember the pain. He remembered the planning, the rehearsals, the constant mental simulations to minimize risk. It wasn't childhood, it was survival. And now, here he was decades later, with more power than he ever imagined, and none of it had stopped those old ghosts from knocking at his door. He had factories on 4 continents, a fleet of satellites, AI that could mimic human speech, even a working prototype for brain-computer interfaces, but he still flinched when his mind wandered too close to the memory of a locker door slamming shut. The old Elon, the one with bruises hidden under long sleeves and a backpack twice his size, lived somewhere inside the current one. And sometimes, like tonight, that version clawed its way back to the surface. He walked slowly across the room, past a framed photograph of SpaceX's first successful launch, and into his home office. The walls here were lined with sleek, silent bookshelves. Modern design, no clutter, everything curated, except for one object. A small, chipped plaque sat awkwardly on the otherwise flawless desk. It had been a gag gift from a former HR executive, someone with a Zen meat startup obsession who believed every executive needed a quote to meditate on. It read, "To forgive is to free yourself from the prison of others." He'd hated it from day one, but he never threw it away. Something about it annoyed him enough to keep it close, like a mosquito that reminded you you're alive. Was that true? Was forgiveness freedom? Or was it just surrender dressed up in noble clothing? He wasn't sure. Sometimes the prison wasn't the memory. Sometimes it was the version of yourself you built in response to that memory, the strong, cold, unreachable version. The Elon who didn't flinch, who didn't need people. That version had built empires, but it had also locked doors, one by one, until the man inside could barely breathe. What if he wasn't keeping Rick out? What if he was just scared to let that younger version of himself go? He leaned against the desk and closed his eyes. For a moment, all he could see was that hallway again, the one near the science lab, where Rick had cornered him more than once. The janitor used to prop the door open with a cinder block, but Rick kicked it out of the way. Elon remembered the sound it made, concrete scraping tile, and how it always preceded pain. That hallway had smelled like sweat and cleaning chemicals. He could still smell it. And Laura, she had never been part of the violence, but she had witnessed it. More than once. She had tried, in her way, to soften the blow. A joke here, a kind word there, sometimes a strategically timed question to distract the bullies. She never laughed with them, never walked away, but she also never intervened directly. Not because she didn't care, but because she was just a teenager too, powerless in her own way. He remembered one afternoon when she slipped him a note with a hand-drawn rocket and a message that said, "Fuel systems online. Get out of orbit." It had made him smile, not because it was funny, but because it made him feel seen. How strange that now, all these years later, she was standing in front of him again, offering a lifeline not to him, but to the very person who had once made him feel invisible. He sat down in the chair and stared at the plaque again. It was still ridiculous, but maybe that was the point. Maybe forgiveness wasn't supposed to be logical. Maybe it wasn't about fairness or resolution. Maybe it was about making space. Not for Rick, but for himself. His phone buzzed softly on the table. A reminder for an early morning call with a team in Tokyo. He ignored it. Instead, he opened a notepad on his tablet and wrote 3 words. Call Dr. Weber. He stared at the screen. The cursor blinked at him like a question mark. But this wasn't a decision. Not yet. It was a gesture. A signal. Maybe he didn't owe Rick anything. Maybe forgiveness was too tall an order. But if there was one thing Elon Musk had learned from years of building impossible things, it was that everything started with a blueprint. Even forgiveness. And tonight, perhaps for the first time, he was willing to sketch one. In the end, he gave in. Not for Rick, but for Laura. There was something in her voice that night, something quiet and unwavering, that cracked the shell he'd spent decades hardening. Not pity, not pressure, just the kind of honesty that reminded him of who she used to be. And maybe deep down, of who he used to be, too. So he drove. No driver, no security detail, no blacked-out SUV. Just Elon behind the wheel of a matte gray Model Y, following a GPS pin dropped in a nondescript suburb about 30 minutes outside the city. The houses here were modest, older but clean, tucked into winding streets, lined with patchy lawns and mailboxes in need of paint. There were no paparazzi, no drone overhead, just the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. He parked across the street and stepped out. For a moment, he stood still, hands in his jacket pockets, unsure whether to knock or turn around. The weight in his chest wasn't fear, it was something heavier, like carrying a box full of memories he hadn't asked to unpack. The house was a 2-story Craftsman, beige with white trim, paint chipped near the eaves. A pair of wind chimes clinked weakly in the breeze. The sound wasn't soothing. It felt too fragile. He didn't go to the front door. Laura had said Rick spent most of his time out back, especially on days when the pain let him move. So Elon walked around the side of the house, boots crunching softly on dry gravel. He found him there in the backyard. Rick was kneeling beside what looked like a half-assembled solar water heater, coils of black tubing, an old metal drum, and a frame made from scavenged aluminum. His hair was thinner than Elon remembered, streaked with gray, and his movements were slow, deliberate, as if every motion had to be negotiated with his body first. He hadn't noticed Elon at first. Not until Elon cleared his throat. Need a hand? The words came out half sarcastic, half awkward. He hadn't planned to say them. They just fell from his mouth, like a challenge thrown into an uncertain wind. Rick turned his head, blinking in surprise. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused, like his brain couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Elon. Elon gave a small shrug. Thought I'd drop by. See what kind of mad science you were up to. Rick pushed himself to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on an old towel. He looked thinner than before, his frame narrower, like someone who used to be broad-shouldered but had been quietly shrinking for years. This is new, Rick said, offering a crooked smile. You offering help? I wouldn't get used to it, Elon replied, but there was no bite in his tone. Just weariness. Silence settled between them. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere beyond the fence, children laughed. The world went on, blissfully unaware of the strange reunion taking place beside a pile of salvage parts. You build this from scrap? Elon finally asked, nodding toward the device. Rick nodded, trying to save on heating costs. Old habits die hard. Plus, it keeps me distracted. Looks like it might explode. Honestly? Probably. Elon smirked. It was the first real smile in days. Rick gestured toward a plastic chair near the porch. You want to sit? I've got water. Maybe lemonade. Laura thinks it's cute to treat me like a guest in my own home. Elon hesitated, then Saturday lemonade's fine. Rick disappeared briefly inside, returning with 2 glasses, one slightly chipped, and handed one over. Elon accepted it without a word. He took a sip. It was overly sweet. Cheap powder mix. He didn't hate it. They sat for a while, not talking, not needing to. The silence wasn't friendly yet, but wasn't hostile either. Just tentative. Like two strangers sitting on the remnants of a battlefield they once fought on opposite sides of. Rick finally broke it. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Do what?" "This. Talk to you. Apologize. Exist in the same space without pretending I didn't." He paused, searching for the right word. "Wreck something." Elon said nothing. "I think about it every day," Rick went on. "Not just what I did to you. To a lot of people. But especially you. You were the one who never fought back. You just took it and kept going. And I hated that." Elon looked over at him. "Why?" Rick stared at his glass. "Because you made me feel small. Not on purpose. Just by being smart. Curious. Unafraid of ideas I didn't even understand. I didn't know how to deal with that, so I did the only thing I was good at back then. I tried to break what I didn't understand." A long pause followed. Elon swirled the lemonade in his glass, then finally asked, "And now?" Rick looked up, eyes tired but clear. "Now I'm trying to rebuild. One piece at a time." The two men sat in silence again. In the background, the solar heater clattered softly in the wind, as if reminding them that time didn't wait for healing. Elon didn't know what came next. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, he wasn't walking away. And that for now was enough. The sun had dropped below the rooftops by the time Rick started talking. It began slowly, hesitantly, like a man walking barefoot across broken glass. Elon sat across from him in the aging plastic chair, the lemonade sweating in his hand, watching as Rick paced near the half-built solar heater, his back to the dying light. He looked smaller than before, not just thinner, but somehow diminished, like a man who'd been worn down layer by layer over the years until only the essentials remained. "I left my job 2 years ago," Rick said, staring at the ground. "Corporate logistics. Nothing glamorous. Long hours, tight margins, angry clients. One day, I just stopped showing up. Couldn't do it anymore." Elon said nothing. He watched. He listened. "I thought it was burnout. Everyone kept calling it that. Said I just needed rest. But it wasn't rest I needed, it was a reckoning." He turned, finally meeting Elon's eyes. And for a moment, Elon saw the faintest glint of something raw behind them. Not defiance. Not pride. Just a man exhausted by carrying too much for too long. "I had a breakdown," Rick admitted. "A real one. Couldn't eat. Couldn't get out of bed. Laura found me in the garage one night, just sitting there, staring at the fuse box. I didn't know how long I'd been there." Elon shifted slightly in his chair, the old plastic creaking beneath him. Still, he said nothing. Therapy helped. Meds helped. But what really changed things was volunteering. Rick looked off toward the fence, where a small patch of tomato plants struggled to survive in the dry Texas soil. "I started at a shelter, just organizing boxes, sweeping floors. No big deal. But then one of the kids asked me to help him with homework. He had no one else. Parents were gone. Teachers gave up. But he was trying. Really trying. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel useless." Elon raised an eyebrow slightly. Rick noticed and gave a self-deprecating smile. "Yeah, I know. Sounds like a cheesy redemption arc guy who bullied half his high school grows a heart, becomes Mr. Rogers." He sat down slowly on the concrete step near the door, wincing as his joints bent into position. "But it wasn't some big moral awakening," he continued. "It was desperation. I had to do something that made me feel human again. That made me believe I could be something other than what I used to be." He ran a hand through his hair, then looked down at his palms, calloused, scarred, work-worn. "So I went back to school. Community college. Studied early childhood education. Got a certificate. Started helping in classrooms. Teaching kids who were just like I used to be, angry, confused, alone. Only I didn't bully them. I listened." Elon stared at him, his expression unreadable. Somewhere inside, something shifted, but it was too early to call it forgiveness. Maybe it was recognition, or maybe just the simple shock of seeing a ghost wearing a different face. "You're not the only one who carries old versions of people around in your head," Rick said, softer now. I carried my own version of me for a long time. That loud, stupid, cruel version. I hated him. Still do. But I try to outrun him. One day at a time. He paused, then added with a weak laugh, doesn't always work. Sometimes he catches up. Elon tilted his head slightly, then finally broke his silence. You ever apologize to the others? Rick nodded slowly. The ones I could find. Some told me to go to hell. Some just hung up. One guy invited me to his wedding. Said if I had changed, I should meet his new life. That one nearly broke me. He looked up. You were the hardest one to face. Elon met his gaze. Because of the stairs. Rick nodded. Because of everything. You were never like the rest of us. You saw further. Dreamed bigger. You were already in the stratosphere, and we were too scared to admit. So we mocked you. Tried to bring you down to earth. But we never could. Not really. For a long moment, neither man spoke. A breeze rustled the wind chimes near the porch, their soft clinking the only sound in the stillness. Elon looked down at his glass, then up at the makeshift solar heater. You know that thing's never going to pass inspection, right? He said dryly. Rick chuckled. Good thing I'm not applying for permits. Elon smirked, and the tension cracked, just a little. There was still a long road ahead. Still too many broken things between them. But tonight, the gap had narrowed. Maybe not by much, but enough to allow the possibility of something neither of them had expected. A second chance. The hours slipped by unnoticed. What had started as a tense, reluctant visit had turned into something else entirely, something neither of them had expected. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no grand emotional epiphanies. Just two men sitting in a fading backyard talking about pain, about time, about everything they used to be, and everything they weren't anymore. The tension that had coiled so tightly around Elon's spine at the start of the conversation had slowly begun to unwind. Rick, for all his nervousness, wasn't hiding behind polished words or self-pity. He spoke plainly, admitting things without embellishment. He didn't try to justify the past. He didn't ask for sympathy. And maybe that's what made it real. It started with a story about a fight he broke up between two kids in an after-school program. Then another about a child who reminded him of Elon, quiet, bookish, always lost in thought. The more Rick spoke, the more Elon listened. And the more he listened, the more he found himself feeling something dangerously close to empathy. He didn't want to. He didn't plan to. But it was there. Somewhere between the talk of public school bureaucracy and a badly burned casserole that Rick once tried to bring to a parent potluck, Elon laughed. Actually laughed. It startled both of them. It was dry, quick, almost involuntary, but real. That small crack in the wall opened something deeper. Rick leaned back against the brick of the house, staring at the sky. You know, he said after a long silence, there hasn't been a Christmas since high school that I haven't written you a letter. Elon glanced over, surprised. A letter? Yeah. Rick nodded. Every year. Usually on the night of Christmas Eve, after Laura went to bed. Sometimes I'd write in the garage, sometimes in the kitchen. I'd pour a drink, sit down, and just start. Elon narrowed his eyes. What the hell would you even write to me? Rick looked at him, his voice steady. Apologies. Confessions. Memories. Regrets. Some were long, 10 pages. Others were just a few lines. But they were all for you. Elon tilted his head. You sent these. Rick shook his head. Never. I wrote them, folded them, put them in an envelope, and stored them in a box. Elon raised an eyebrow. Why? Rick hesitated, then said, because sending them would have been selfish. You didn't owe me the time, and I didn't earn your attention. Writing them wasn't for you, it was for me. It was my way of keeping myself accountable, of remembering who I used to be, and why I couldn't ever let myself go back there. Elon studied him, suddenly quiet. Rick stood slowly, disappearing inside for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a beat-up cardboard box, medium-sized, sealed with clear tape, the edges soft from age and use. He knelt carefully beside the table and peeled it open. Inside were hundreds of envelopes, all addressed in the same hand, to Elon Musk. Some yellowed with time, some crisp and clean. A few had water stains. A few had been torn and resealed. All were dated, all unopened. "I keep them in order," Rick said, pulling out a stack and placing them on the table. The first one was written in December 1995. The last was this past Christmas, 2 months ago. Elon reached out and picked one up carefully. The handwriting was neat, almost rigid. The date read December 24th, 2002. He held it for a moment, unsure why it felt so heavy, as if paper could carry pain. "I thought about burning them once," Rick admitted, "but I couldn't. Every one of these letters reminded me of something I needed to face. Writing them kept me honest. Writing them kept me from lying to myself." Elon didn't open the envelope. He didn't even ask to. He just stared at the pile of apologies from a man who had once laughed while he bled. Rick sat again, visibly worn out. His voice had softened into something smaller, more fragile. "Writing became my penitence. I knew I couldn't erase what I'd done, but I could make sure I never forgot it. I never wanted to forget. That would have been too easy." Elon placed the letter back into the box, slowly, carefully. There were no words for what he felt, not yet. But something had shifted. The hatred that once burned hot inside him was still there, but now it was mingled with something harder to hold on to, something uncomfortably close to understanding. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked finally. "Because I'm dying," Rick said plainly. "And I didn't want you to hear that secondhand. I wanted you to know that I spent half my life trying to make up for the other half. And I thought maybe, just maybe, you deserve to know." Elon leaned back in his chair and looked at the sky. A few stars had started to peek through the deepening blue. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in a long time, Elon Musk, the man of quick wit, sharp edges, and world-changing ideas, was at a loss for words. He wasn't angry. He wasn't forgiving. He was simply human. And for tonight, maybe that was enough. The days that followed moved in fragments, pieces of reality suspended between phone calls, flights, and quiet reflection. Elon didn't make a big announcement or inform the press. There were no tweets, no official statements. But behind the scenes, something shifted. He began reaching out. First to Dr. Anke Weber, the mitochondrial researcher in Munich, whom he'd once collaborated with on an unrelated Neuralink study. She remembered him immediately. How could she forget? But when he brought up Rick's case, her tone turned clinical. "There are trials," she said, "but enrollment is highly competitive. The therapy's in phase 2. We're not curing people yet. We're learning." Elon pressed, not with his usual business urgency, but with quiet insistence. He offered to cover transport, housing, equipment, anything Rick would need to qualify. Then he contacted a private institute in Zurich conducting experimental diagnostics, followed by a lab in Berlin specializing in gene editing. Within a week, Rick Danvers had 3 international teams reviewing his case file. It should have felt like a victory, like progress. But Elon didn't feel triumphant. In truth, he wasn't even sure why he was doing it. Late one evening, he sat in the Tesla design lab, surrounded by 3D renders of future prototypes, reviewing Rick's medical files in silence. The screen glowed with lab reports, MRI scans, pages of acronyms and probabilities. But it wasn't the numbers that weighed on him. It was the question Laura had asked before he left their house. Are you still angry at him, or at who you were back then? He hadn't answered. Not because he didn't know, but because he did. The truth sat in his chest like a stone. He wasn't just angry at Rick. He was angry at that version of himself, the boy who tolerated it, who swallowed the pain, who flinched and laughed it off and let his silence become a shield. That boy had dreamed of rockets because space was the only place far enough to escape from reality. Now, decades later, with real rockets under his name, he still hadn't fully escaped. Laura's words echoed louder with each passing day. Elon moved through boardrooms and briefing calls like a man going through the motions, but underneath, he was unraveling something deeper than a disease. He was confronting a part of himself he had sealed off in the pursuit of greatness. At night, he would pace the halls of his modern house, unable to sleep. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was accusing. The success, the brilliance, the empire, it all felt fragile when held up against a teenage locker door slamming shut. He thought about how he used to look in the mirror after a particularly bad day in school and imagine himself older, stronger, unbreakable. He would imagine a future where no one could touch him, where the name Elon meant power and genius and untouchability. And now that he had it, all of it, it felt like he was still that same boy, just dressed in bulletproof fabric. One afternoon, while reviewing a research grant for the Zurich lab, he got a message from Laura. "Rick wants to know if you're okay. He says you've been quieter than usual." Elon stared at the text for a long time, thumb hovering over the reply. Quieter than usual, from a man who used to weaponize silence against him. The irony stung. He didn't answer the message. Not right away. Instead, he forwarded Rick's updated medical reports to Dr. Weber with a single line. "Let's do whatever it takes to get him into the program." That night, he met with his executive assistant for updates. She began listing progress reports on Starlink's expansion, then paused. "You seem different lately," she said carefully. Elon raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "More focused, but less." "Elon, does that make sense?" He smirked faintly. "Not at all." She left it at that, but her words lingered after she was gone. He was different, but he couldn't name the difference yet. It wasn't clarity. It wasn't peace. It was something raw and shifting, like tectonic plates adjusting after a long period of stillness. The more he helped Rick, the more he realized this wasn't just about a dying man. It was about stitching together something in himself that had torn long ago. He found himself reading one of the letters Rick had left for him. The envelope was dated 2009. Inside was a single sentence. "I hope someday you build a ship strong enough to carry your pain into the stars and leave it there." Elon read it 3 times. Then he folded it back, placed it in a drawer, and didn't speak of it again. But something in him softened. The bitterness hadn't disappeared. The past couldn't be undone. But in choosing to help, even begrudgingly, he was rewriting the script he had lived by for so long, the one where strength meant distance and forgiveness meant weakness. Maybe Laura was right. Maybe it wasn't about Rick at all. Maybe it never had been. The news came on a rainy Wednesday. Rick had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Fatigue that wouldn't lift, tremors that worsened by the hour, an episode of temporary disorientation that sent him collapsing in the hallway. Laura called Elon mid-meeting. She didn't beg. She didn't dramatize. Her voice was calm, tired, heavy with a truth she didn't need to spell out. "He needs to go," she said. "It has to be now. The doctors in Munich are ready for intake, but they need a complete genetic panel first. Very specific engineering scans. The kind only 2 labs in the world can run." Elon hung up without asking for details. He knew what had to be done. He rerouted an executive transport jet to Austin, arranged for in-home medical assistance, and had 2 of his engineers reprogram the diagnostic scanner at a private facility in Zurich to fast-track Rick's genomic mapping. On paper, it was all precise, all efficient, exactly how Elon liked things. A problem, a solution, a chain of events executed at speed. He told himself this was what mattered now. Saving time, optimizing treatment, keeping Rick alive long enough for the experimental therapy to begin. But that night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he dreamed of a hallway. Bryanston High again. Not the real one. Not exactly. Dreams distort memory, like old film negatives soaked in water. The colors were wrong, too gray, too sharp. The lockers loomed larger than they ever were in real life, their metal surfaces dented like old armor. He could hear the bell ringing, but there were no other students. Just the echo of footsteps behind him. He tried to walk faster, but the footsteps followed. Then came the slam. That familiar, awful slam. The locker door shut in front of him, except this time, he was already inside. Darkness closed around him like a steel fist. And then the laugh. Rick's laugh. Not the older Rick, not the one with tremors and guilt. No, the 17-year-old version. the one who stood over him as he bled. That voice, hollow and cruel, ringing out like a whip crack in the metal chamber of memory. Elon jolted awake, soaked in sweat, the sheets twisted around his legs like restraints. The room was dark, but his chest burned as if he were still trapped inside that locker. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, fingers pressed against his forehead. It wasn't the dream that scared him, it was the clarity, the vividness, the realization that a part of him still lived in that corridor, that the trauma hadn't just shaped him, it had rooted in him, like wiring fused into the structure of who he became. He checked his phone. No new messages. The jet was scheduled to depart at sunrise. In a few hours, Rick would be on his way to a country halfway around the world, where scientists in white coats would study his DNA and try to unravel the disease eating away at his nervous system. Elon had made it happen. Money, access, logistics, none of it had slowed him down. But his heart, that was a different story. He had done everything he could from a distance. Coordinated teams, sent equipment, pulled strings. But when Laura asked if he would travel with them, to offer support, to be there, even just for the flight, Elon had hesitated. He hadn't said no, but he hadn't said yes. The thought of being trapped in that confined jet cabin with Rick for 10 hours filled him with a strange dread he couldn't explain. It wasn't about hatred, not anymore. It was about something deeper, something more dangerous. Trust, because that was the final barrier. Not money, not forgiveness. Trusting that Rick wasn't the same boy who shoved him into lockers and called him alien trash. Trusting that the man asking for help wasn't secretly laughing behind his back, waiting for weakness. And the truth? Elon didn't know how to do that. He had built a life on skepticism. His brain was a fortress of logic, probabilities, and control. He trusted machines, equations, the silence of space. But people broke you. People changed the rules. People hurt you just to see if you'd survive. He thought about that box of letters again, 200 apologies never sent, never expected to be answered. What kind of man does that? And then he remembered Rick's face when he talked about the boy in his class, the one who reminded him of Elon. The look in his eyes. Not pity, not performance, pain. And for the first time, Elon considered something he hadn't before. Maybe Rick wasn't just asking to be forgiven. Maybe Rick was trying to forgive himself. That night, Elon walked through the halls of his house like a man pacing through fog. He stared at blueprints that made no sense and ran simulations he didn't care about. His mind wasn't in the future anymore. It was stuck somewhere between then and now. By morning, he hadn't slept, but the decision was made. He picked up his phone and sent Laura a single message. "I'll fly with you." Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and waited for the sun. The breakthrough didn't come with a flash of lightning or a dramatic speech. It came on a quiet, rainy Tuesday in Zurich. The sky outside was thick with gray, the kind of weather that made everything feel suspended, conversations, decisions, even time itself. Elon sat in a narrow conference room at the Research Institute, reviewing energy grid schematics on a large touchscreen, his fingers tapping in a rapid but uneven rhythm. The project was critical, an initiative designed to bring sustainable energy storage to disaster zones where infrastructure had collapsed. A network of microcells, dynamically adaptable, lightweight, rugged. It was ambitious and stuck. He had spent the past 2 days trying to locate a fault in the load balancing algorithm. Something wasn't adding up. A performance loss of nearly 9% across the predictive model, and no one on his engineering team could isolate the cause. The system should have worked. The math should have held. But it didn't. And it gnawed at him. "Everything okay?" Laura asked gently from the corner, where she was reviewing Rick's latest test schedule. He was resting upstairs after a long session of mitochondrial extraction diagnostics. Elon didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. "It's fine," he muttered. "Just an equation fighting back." From behind him came a familiar voice, soft, hoarse, but clear. "Is it the disaster grid model?" Elon turned. Rick was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a light zip-up jacket, his skin paler than usual, but his eyes alert. The doctors had warned him to rest, but he had a stubborn streak that reminded Elon, uncomfortably, of himself. "What do you know about energy grid modeling?" Elon asked, eyebrow raised, not without a trace of sarcasm. Rick smiled faintly. "Probably not enough to impress you, but I did spend a year in a remote tech program after I left corporate, focused on energy systems for off-grid shelters. Thought maybe I'd end up designing sustainable infrastructure for youth centers. Never did, but the coursework stuck." Elon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So what? You're offering to solve my equation now?" Rick stepped inside slowly. "No, I'm offering to look." For a second, Elon hesitated. Every instinct told him to wave it off. But then again, what harm could it do? The file was open. The math was public. And maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that wanted to test Rick in a way that had nothing to do with memory or morality. Just numbers. He slid the tablet toward him. "Be my guest." Rick sat beside him, moving cautiously, his hands shaking just slightly as he adjusted the zoom on the screen. Elon watched silently. He expected Rick to skim the surface, fumble with the logic, bluff his way through. But that didn't happen. Instead, Rick's eyes narrowed. His fingers moved with careful precision. "Line 47, Rick murmured after a minute. "You're double-counting a localized feedback loop in the stress event parameter. It's subtle, but the equation reintroduces the load before the control node stabilizes. That's where your energy loss is." Elon blinked. He leaned in, re-ran the model. The numbers shifted. The gap gone. Completely. He stared at the tablet like it had just insulted him, then looked over at Rick, who was now sipping from a water bottle, as if nothing had happened. "You actually studied this?" Rick gave a modest shrug. "I wasn't always a bully, you know. I had brains. I just didn't know what to do with them back then." Elon chuckled. It surprised him. "I spent 6 hours on that." "You were probably overthinking it." "That's usually my best feature." Rick gave a lopsided grin. "Maybe, but sometimes looking at something broken teaches you how to fix it." Elon stared at him, then, without ceremony, extended his hand across the table. Rick looked at it for a long second, then reached out and shook it. No speech, no fanfare, but something passed between them in that moment. A shift. The final wall, thin, transparent, but stubborn, crumbled. For years, Elon had seen Rick as a caricature in his memory, a villain frozen in time. But now, across the table, sat a man who had studied quietly, volunteered humbly, written hundreds of unsent letters, and, most remarkably, corrected an equation Elon himself couldn't solve. He was no longer the boy who stood at the top of the staircase, laughing. He was something else now. Human, flawed, repentant, and capable. For the first time, Elon didn't just feel the absence of hatred, he felt the quiet hum of respect beginning to form. "I could use help on the Brazil deployment team," Elon said almost casually. Rick looked surprised. "Seriously? You'd be remote. Limited hours. You can't lift anything heavier than that water bottle." Rick nodded slowly. "I'd be honored." Elon stood, stretched, and walked toward the window. Rain streaked the glass, soft and persistent. Zurich shimmered beneath the clouded sky. He spoke without turning. "Don't make me regret it." "You won't," Rick said, and this time Elon believed him. "You were always the smartest guy in the room, Musk," Rick said, his voice low but steady. "I was just better at hiding my fear behind jokes, behind fists, behind whatever made me feel bigger than I was." He didn't say it for effect. There was no dramatic pause, no seeking of pity in his tone. It came out like a confession long rehearsed, but never spoken aloud. Something simple, something true. Elon didn't answer right away. He sat still, arms resting on his knees, staring at the floor of the Zurich Institute's lounge. The room was quiet, too quiet for how full it had once felt. Laura had stepped out to take call. The doctors had left them alone. Just two men, alone in a space filled with the ghosts of who they had been. A long breath passed between them. Elon slowly lifted his gaze and studied Rick, Not the posture or the clothes or the graying stubble, but the face. The eyes. The places where guilt had etched lines too deep to be faked. The places where fear had once lived, now replaced with something heavier, understanding. He didn't see an enemy anymore. He saw something far more uncomfortable. He saw himself, or at least a reflection. Not in action, but in essence. The young Elon, introverted and bruised, had built his armor from equations and silence. Rick had built his from sarcasm and cruelty. Both had been afraid. Both had felt small in a world that made no room for softness. Only Elon had learned to launch his pain into the sky. Rick had turned his inward until it curdled. Now, decades later, they sat with the ruins of all that armor crumbling between them. "It's strange," Elon finally said, voice rougher than he expected. "I used to dream about this moment. Not this exact one, but something like it. You apologizing. Me hearing it. I always thought I'd feel victorious." Rick gave a small nod. "And now?" Elon looked away, then back. "Now, I just feel tired." Rick gave a breath of laughter, dry and soft. "That makes two of us." There was a pause. Not awkward, just honest. "I meant what I said," Rick continued. "I wasn't afraid of you because you were weird. I was afraid of you because you were certain. You knew what you loved. You didn't flinch. You didn't follow the script. That kind of confidence, it made me hate my own confusion." Elon didn't argue. He didn't need to. Rick leaned back slightly, as if something in him had finally exhaled after years of holding tension. "When I saw you walk out of that gala a few weeks ago," he said, "I thought that was it. I thought I'd missed my only chance. I didn't blame you. I still don't." Elon gave the faintest of nods, then stood slowly. Rick looked up, uncertain. And then, to both their surprise, Elon extended his hand, not for a handshake this time, for an embrace. Rick stood, unsure for a beat, then stepped forward. The two men hugged, if it could be called that. It was stiff, hesitant, marked by decades of distance. But it was real. A gesture of two lives colliding not in rage, but in recognition. It didn't last long. It didn't need to. They stepped back, almost simultaneously, both clearing their throats like boys pretending not to cry. "I'm not sure what this means," Elon admitted, adjusting his jacket as if to brush away the emotion. Rick nodded. "Me neither. But it means something." "It does," Rick agreed. "More than I deserve, probably." Elon shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe this is what people do when they grow up." Rick laughed again, deeper this time. "Took us long enough." Outside, the rain had started again, soft against the windows like a rhythmic echo of time passing. The kind of rain that wasn't meant to wash anything away, but to soften the soil enough for something new to grow. Elon walked to the window and looked out across the Zurich skyline. Clean lines, quiet streets, glass reflecting gray skies. He thought of rockets, of Mars, of the endless complexity of futures yet to be born. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was here, on Earth, in this room, in this human moment. Behind him, Rick sat down again, slower this time but straighter somehow. Like a man finally putting something heavy down. Elon turned back and spoke without preamble. "You're on the Brazil deployment team now. Limited hours. Remote coordination only. I already informed the lead engineer." Rick blinked. "You serious? You proved yourself. And I'm short on people who actually care about the work." Rick gave a quiet smile. "Thank you." Elon nodded once, then walked toward the door. Before he stepped out, he turned one last time. "Try not to mess it up." Rick raised his glass of water in a small toast. "No promises, but I'll try." And with that, the door shut behind Elon, softly without echo. Peace doesn't always come with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a quiet, awkward hug between two men who finally stopped seeing ghosts and started seeing each other. Europe softened everything. The pace, the voices, even the light, it all moved differently in that part of the world, like time itself had agreed to slow down for the sake of healing. Rick's treatment continued at a private neurological institute in the outskirts of Lucerne, nestled between Alpine Hills and Mirrored Lakes. It wasn't a miracle cure, not yet, but the results were promising. His coordination improved. The tremors lessened. He could walk longer without rest. Most importantly, the doctors no longer spoke in uncertain past tenses. Musk had made it all happen. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. He didn't publicize it, didn't add it to his portfolio of humanitarian projects or spin it into a redemption headline. This wasn't for the world. This wasn't even for Rick. This, he would later realize, was for something else. Something harder to name. They didn't speak every day. In fact, sometimes they went weeks without a word. But every few visits to Europe, when Musk had business in Berlin or Zurich or Amsterdam, he'd reroute the itinerary. Just a quick drop-in, a 15-minute coffee, a shared silence watching the rain fall through hospital windows. No obligation, no need to say more than necessary. And then one day, Rick asked if he wanted to join him in Vienna. It was a small event, just an afternoon session at a local primary school. Rick had been invited to speak during Empathy Week, something the Austrian Ministry of Education had been promoting in underserved neighborhoods. He brought with him a small, programmable robot, something Musk had shipped from a Tesla dev lab in California. It rolled, waved, and said simple phrases in multiple languages. Nothing revolutionary, but to 8-year-olds it was magic. They stood in the back of the classroom while Rick adjusted the robot's settings. "These kids have never seen tech up close," Rick said quietly, crouching next to the table. "Most of them associate robots with cartoons or surveillance drones. This little guy is going to say hello, introduce itself, and then help me talk about what it means to be kind." Elon folded his arms, watching the room. "You're making a robot lecture about empathy?" Rick smirked. "That's the goal." When the children entered, tiny feet, big eyes, whispered giggles, Elon stepped aside, retreating toward the back wall. He wasn't there to be seen. This wasn't his show. The presentation was simple, almost clumsy at times. The robot's voice had a slight delay. One of the kids kept poking it in the eye. Rick laughed, adjusted, improvised. He didn't try to impress them, he just connected. He spoke about fear, about how it sometimes disguises itself as cruelty. He talked about what it means to say you're sorry and to mean it. And then, with surprising ease, he told them about Musk. Not by name, but by essence. He told the story of a boy in his school who dreamed about space, who didn't fit in, and who got hurt because of it. He talked about what it meant to live with that regret and how it took him years to realize that healing doesn't start with being forgiven. It starts with being honest. Musk watched from the corner, still as stone. He didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. When the kids finally swarmed the robot, trying to get it to speak Klingon or sing Let It Go, Rick stood to the side, wiping his brow. He looked back toward Musk, who met his eyes briefly and gave a subtle nod. Nothing more. After the session, Laura, who had flown in from Zurich to watch, stood next to Elon near the doorway, watching the children hug Rick like he was some kind of wizard who had conjured wisdom from recycled plastic. "You smiled," she said quietly. Elon didn't respond. "You don't do that often," she added. He let out a small breath. "He's better with kids than I expected." Laura smiled knowingly. "You're proud of him." He hesitated. "I'm glad he's useful." She turned to face him. "You still can't say it, can you?" "Say what?" "That he's your friend." Musk didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, he watched as Rick crouched down next to the robot, letting a small boy with crooked glasses press buttons that made it dance. The boy laughed so hard he nearly fell over. Musk's expression softened, but only slightly. "Maybe one day," he murmured. Laura nodded, satisfied. Later that evening, they walked through Vienna's cobbled streets in silence. The sky was violet, dusk painting the buildings in soft gold. They didn't talk about the past or the future, just the present, quiet, unassuming, and for once, undisturbed by ghosts. Rick didn't ask for validation. He didn't press for acknowledgement. And Musk no longer needed to pretend he wasn't watching. They weren't friends yet, but they were no longer enemies. And in the long arc of healing, that was more than enough for now. It happened on a Thursday years later beneath the glow of floodlights and polished chrome. The latest Neuralink summit was in full swing, a curated blend of futurists, scientists, media, and curious investors packed into a converted industrial hall in San Francisco. The event marked the unveiling of a new neural interface suite, more adaptive than anything previously demonstrated, with breakthrough applications in mobility, cognition, and sensory augmentation. It was a momentous day, even by Musk standards. Elon had just finished a brief, unscripted candid, something he'd grown more comfortable doing as the years passed. His tone had softened over time, less defensive, more reflective. His answers weren't only about technology anymore, they were about connection, human limits, possibility. He didn't say it, but those who listened closely could feel the shift. As he stepped back, the lights dimmed and a moderator took the stage to close the session. That's when it happened. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd as someone slowly approached from the far side of the platform. A man with a cane, measured steps, familiar frame, still tall, still proud, but moving with the careful determination of someone who had rebuilt himself inch by inch. It was Rick. Elon blinked in surprise. They hadn't seen each other in nearly a year. Elon had heard that Rick had been consulting quietly with accessibility tech startups in Northern Europe, giving talks at universities about emotional intelligence in engineering, and even mentoring developers who had no idea about the man's complicated past. But this was unexpected. Rick reached the center of the stage and took the mic with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer carried the weight of pretending. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, smiling into the crowd. "I asked for 5 minutes. They gave me 3. I'll try to split the difference." Laughter rippled through the room. He turned to Elon. "I know this isn't the usual part of the program, but there's something I need to say. Publicly." Elon stood off to the side, hands loosely folded, watching intently. "This project, this evolution of Neuralink, what it represents, it doesn't exist in a vacuum," Rick continued. "Ideas don't appear fully formed. They come from seeds, some planted decades before they ever sprout." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. "This," he said, holding it up, "is one of those seeds." The audience watched curious. Rick walked slowly, deliberately, across the stage and handed the envelope to Elon. Elon took it cautiously, like he wasn't sure what it might contain. He opened the flap and carefully pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Several smaller sketches fell out, scans, it looked like, of notebook pages. Graphite lines, scribbles in the margins, diagrams, equations. There were annotations added in different handwriting. He recognized them instantly. They were his, drawn in high school, back when his mind buzzed with uncontainable visions of thought-to-text interfaces, direct input-to-action conversion, dream recording headbands. Ideas so far ahead of their time, they had once been labeled childish by teachers, obsessive by counselors. He hadn't thought about them in decades, but Rick had kept them. "I stole those," Rick said to the crowd. "A long time ago. I thought they were weird, even funny, but I didn't throw them away. Something in them stuck with me. I couldn't understand all of it, but I felt it. Even back then." He turned back to Elon. "You gave me a second chance. A chance to become a better man. To matter. And for years, I wonder how I could ever repay something like that." He gestured toward the crowd. "So I took your idea. And I made it work. Not alone, of course, but I helped. I added layers. I translated what I couldn't grasp as a boy into something real." The screen behind them flickered to life, showing a close-up of a new auxiliary interface module, compact, elegantly simple. A small neural bridge designed to supplement weakened pathways in patients with motor decline. The foundation of the architecture was unmistakably Musk's, decades-old concepts drawn in adolescent shorthand. But the refinement, the precision, the emotional logic of its application, that was Rick. The crowd applauded. Some stood. Rick wasn't emotional. but his voice wavered just enough to reveal the gravity. "I owe you a lifetime of apologies," he said, looking Elon straight in the eyes. "But this is the one thing I could give that might start to repay the debt." Elon stared at the pages in his hands. He didn't smile, not immediately, but his face shifted, something unspoken moving through him, like a tide. Recognition, gratitude, maybe even awe. He wasn't a man easily surprised. But this reached a place so deep he didn't even know it was still open. He stepped forward, extended a hand. Rick took it, and then, without a word, they embraced again. This time, no stiffness, no hesitation. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. It was something else. Respect. Full circle. The room erupted in applause, but neither of them seemed to hear it. In that moment, there was only the sound of two lives, once fractured by violence and shame, finally fitting back together in quiet, unexpected harmony. For a moment, the auditorium stood frozen. Even after the applause faded, the silence that followed was not empty, it was reverent. Hundreds of people, engineers, investors, scientists, skeptics, held their breath. Something had shifted in the room, something unspoken, yet undeniably powerful. The kind of moment that doesn't get coded into press releases or earnings reports. Elon Musk didn't move. He stood at center stage, holding the yellowed sheet of paper in one hand, the ghost of his younger self staring back at him through graphite lines and uneven formulas. The crowd had just witnessed a story of decades compressed into a single human gesture. A man, once broken and shamed, presenting something he had carried quietly for years. A redemption arc so unlikely it felt like fiction. Elon's eyes remained fixed on the paper. A smudge of graphite near the corner brought back a memory. A bored Tuesday in 10th grade, the edge of a desk chewed by time, the sound of laughter in the hallway that always meant trouble was close. These drawings were never meant for daylight. They were fragments of dreams, scribbled between bruises and mockery. Then suddenly he laughed. It was not his usual smirk or that charismatic half-chuckle meant to lighten a tense boardroom. No, this was different. It was softer, lighter, the laugh of someone realizing the universe still had room for irony and healing. He stepped forward and leaned slightly into the microphone. "Life is strange," he said. His voice was calm, grounded. A pause, just enough for the weight to settle. "Sometimes," he continued, "the guy who shoved you into a locker is the same one who opens a door for you 20 years later." The room erupted, not into laughter but applause, pure and unfiltered. It began with a few quick claps, then multiplied until the sound swallowed the entire hall. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. Everyone in that space, no matter their title or degree, had carried something from their past. And for a moment, Elon's words reached that part of them. In the front row, Laura stood slowly. Her hands met each other softly at first, then more resolutely. Her eyes shimmered with tears that threatened to fall, but never did. She had seen these men before they became versions of themselves they could finally be proud of. She remembered the pain, the silence, the attempts to mend things with laughter, with notes, with distance. And now this. Elon looked toward her, and their eyes met just briefly. No words were needed. He turned back to Rick. Their eyes locked, and Elon gave the smallest nod. Then, clearly into the microphone, he said two words. "Thank you." There was no sarcasm, no detachment, just sincerity, raw and unadorned. Rick's posture shifted slightly, and for a moment he seemed taller than he was. Not physically, but emotionally, as if those words had released something he didn't know he was still holding. They stood side by side again beneath the glare of lights designed to showcase innovation, and instead they showcased something older, more profound, grace. "I kept the papers because they were good," Rick had said earlier, but now Elon understood the deeper reason. The past wasn't just baggage. It was soil, and sometimes the things we bury come back as flowers. "Let's build better minds," Elon added, gesturing toward the Neuralink prototype displayed on the massive screen behind them. "But let's also build better hearts." This time, the standing ovation came faster, louder, but Elon wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at Rick, and through him, at a part of himself he had spent decades avoiding. Later, backstage, the buzz of the summit resumed like a chorus of bees. PR teams scrambled to get statements ready. Engineers passed updated specs across sleek, glowing screens. Journalists argued over headlines. But in the center of the storm, two chairs sat untouched near the curtain. Elon joined Rick, handing him a bottle of water without a word. Rick took it, still catching his breath. "You held up," Elon said. "Barely," Rick replied with a smirk. "My legs are going to kill me tomorrow." Elon chuckled and sat beside him. They didn't need to say more. For once, silence was enough. After a long pause, Elon reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded sheet of paper again. He looked at it one last time, then handed it to Rick. "You should keep this," he said. Rick hesitated. "It's yours. It always was." Elon shook his head. "You gave it meaning. I just drew it." Rick took it slowly, like it was glass. He unfolded the page, stared at the jagged pencil marks, and something in his eyes changed. It wasn't nostalgia. It was peace. The sound of cameras clicking outside faded. The lights dimmed behind the curtain. In that quiet, unremarkable backstage corner, the story found its breath again, not as a tech breakthrough or a press highlight, but as something rare and unmarketable. Redemption earned, respect returned, and peace after a very long war. And that's how Elon Musk finally learned a truth that no algorithm could model, no launch sequence could simulate, and no quarterly report could quantify. Not every monster from your past remains one in your present. Some, in time, become mirrors, forcing you to see not only the pain they caused, but the scars you still carry from it. Others become something rarer, something you never expect. Bridges. Rick Danvers had been a ghost in Elon's memory for years, a name tied to a bruise, a smell, a sound. The clang of a locker door, the sting of humiliation, the bitter silence that came after. In Elon's rise from bullied teen to world shaper, Rick had been part of the gravity he fought to escape, a symbol of what he'd outgrown. But over time, and through actions, not words, Rick changed. And Elon, against every instinct of self-protection, let him. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But the shift came, quietly and powerfully. The man who once locked him in a dark, metal cabinet now helped design tools that lit up the neural map of the human brain. Not to dominate it, but to repair it. Not to control minds, but to reconnect them. And in doing so, Rick had given Elon something no investor, no government agency, no admiring fan had ever offered him. Relief. Not relief from responsibility or pressure or innovation, but from the part of himself that never stopped trying to prove he had survived. Because sometimes surviving isn't about rising. It's about releasing. Forgiveness didn't arrive in a flash. It came in layers. A visit, a conversation, a glass of lemonade on a plastic chair in an uneven backyard. A reappearance on stage holding a relic from a past Elon had tried to forget. And finally that quiet, trembling embrace, awkward at first, then real. Elon never said the word friend. He didn't have to. It was in the gesture, in the space he made for Rick to exist in his orbit again, not as a threat, but as a tether. Not to the past, but to possibility. Rick, for his part, never asked for anything more. He kept showing up, helping where he could, never claiming too much credit, never forgetting how far he'd come. He had once written letters he never sent, praying for forgiveness. Now he built neural bridges that made speech possible again for those who thought they had lost their voice forever. Irony? Maybe. Justice? Closer. But redemption? Yes. That was the word. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't trend on social media. But it mattered. In every neuron, in every line of code, in every life touched by the technology they shaped together. In the years that followed, Elon still launched rockets, still challenged systems, still obsessed over how to land on Mars. But those who worked closest to him noticed the shift. He didn't micromanage quite as much. He let people make mistakes more often. He asked quieter questions. smiled more. And when someone failed, he didn't always push them out. Sometimes he pulled up a chair. And on one unremarkable Tuesday, a new engineer at Neuralink accidentally left a bug in the system that caused the interface simulator to crash mid-demo. Flustered, he turned to Elon and apologized profusely, expecting the usual fire. But Elon just looked at him and said almost to himself, "We were just kids once too." He said it without anger. He said it with memory. And in that moment, a strange thing happened. He let go. He let go of being the kid who had to prove himself. Let go of the belief that power made him untouchable. Let go of the old narrative that pain must be erased to be overcome. Because sometimes pain isn't the enemy. Sometimes pain is the place where transformation begins. As for Rick, he kept teaching, not in universities, but in community labs. He taught young inventors who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. He told them about a boy named Elon who dreamed about linking thought and machine. And then he told them about the man Elon became. He never mentioned the locker, but he always mentioned the lemonade. And if you ask Laura, who still keeps in touch with both of them, sometimes over video calls that drift into midnight, she'll tell you that the real miracle wasn't the chip, or the rockets, or the AI. It was two people who dared to try again. And maybe that's where real innovation begins. Not in labs, not in code, but in forgiveness. In the courage to say, "I see who you were, I see who you are, and I still believe you can be more." So if you're still here watching this story unfold, thank you. Now I want to ask you something, and not in that tired, predictable comment below way you've heard 1,000 times. Instead, tell me this. Where in the world are you watching from? And who is the person from your past that you never thought you'd forgive, but maybe, just maybe, you're ready to see differently now? Or flip it. Who have you hurt and wish you could sit across from one more time? Not to erase what happened, but to build something new from it. You don't have to explain everything. Just leave your city, or a name, or one word that means something only to you. We read it all. And who knows, maybe your story, like Elon and Rick's, isn't finished yet.